The daguerreotype measured 3.5 inches by 4, mounted in a pressed paper case lined with purple velvet. Margaret Adelaide Thornton sat in the center, 9 years old, wearing her best Sunday dress with the lace collar her mother had ordered from Charleston. Her hands rested in her lap. Her eyes stared straight ahead the way the photographer had instructed, and behind her left shoulder, blurred but unmistakable, was the face of a hanged man. The image should not have been there. Silas Webb had taken only one exposure that October afternoon in 1854, and the girl had been entirely alone in the frame. Yet when the plate was developed, another figure appeared, suspended, head cocked at the terrible angle of a broken neck, features distorted by death, but recognizable enough to 6 people who saw the photograph before it was destroyed, or supposedly destroyed. Because 3 months later, a second copy appeared in Boston, then Philadelphia, then New York. Someone had been making prints before the original vanished, and what those copies revealed would haunt Beaufort District, South Carolina, for the next 70 years. October 17th, 1854. The heat that morning carried the weight of low-country humidity, even though autumn had officially arrived 2 weeks earlier. Silas Webb drove his wagon down the live oak avenue toward Thornton Hall plantation, Spanish moss hanging from branches like torn curtains, the air thick with the smell of salt marsh and something else, smoke from the sugar mill where they were already processing the first cane of the season. Webb was 42 years old, a traveling daguerreotypist who had learned the trade in New Haven before the economy there collapsed. Now he worked a circuit through South Carolina and Georgia, setting up his portable studio in parlors and on porches, capturing the faces of people who could afford the $3 sitting fee. He had photographed judges and merchants, plantation mistresses and their children, even a few preachers who wanted their likenesses preserved for posterity. He kept his opinions about the institution that funded these portraits to himself, because a man who spoke too freely in the South found his business drying up fast. But Webb was not entirely neutral. In the false bottom of his equipment trunk, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath bottles of chemicals, he carried 16 daguerreotypes that no customer had commissioned. Images of auction blocks in Charleston, scarred backs photographed in dim light, the interior of a slave pen in Savannah. He sent these north every few months, to contacts in the American Anti-Slavery Society who used them in pamphlets and exhibitions, proof that the peculiar institution was not the benevolent arrangement its defenders claimed. The work was dangerous. If discovered, Webb would be arrested, possibly hanged. South Carolina did not tolerate abolitionists, and it especially did not tolerate those who documented the reality behind the plantation myth. He reached the main house at 9:30. Thornton Hall was a 2-story structure of whitewashed brick with 8 columns across the front. The paint was peeling in places, and one of the shutters hung crooked, but the scale of the building announced wealth and power. Edmund Thornton owned 1,400 acres and 83 enslaved people. He served on the county commission. His wife, Louisa, came from a Charleston family that had owned land since the 1700s. A house servant met Webb at the steps, a woman in her 30s who introduced herself as Sarah. She led him through the entrance hall into the parlor where Mrs. Thornton waited. The room smelled of beeswax and camphor. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light, and the furniture was dark mahogany, ornate but old. Louisa Thornton was 34, dressed in black silk despite the heat. She greeted Webb with cool politeness and explained what she wanted. A portrait of her daughter Margaret, who would turn 10 in December. A keepsake, she said. Something to remember her by. The phrasing struck Webb as odd. Remember her by. as if the child were dying or going away. "Is your daughter ill, ma'am?" "No." Louisa's hands twisted a handkerchief. "But childhood is brief, Mr. Webb. I want her face preserved before time steals it." Every mother's sentiment, delivered in a tone that suggested something heavier underneath. Margaret Adelaide Thornton appeared at 11 o'clock, brought downstairs by Sarah. The girl was small for 9, with dark hair pulled back severely and pale skin that suggested she spent little time outdoors. She wore a gray dress with a white collar, and her expression carried the careful blankness of children who had learned that showing emotion earned consequences. Webb had photographed dozens of children. Most fidgeted, some cried, a few performed, mugging for the camera or refusing to sit still. Margaret did none of these things. She walked into the parlor, sat in the chair her mother indicated, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at Webb with eyes that seemed much older than 9. "She's very good at being still," Louisa said, standing behind Webb as he adjusted his camera. "Aren't you, Margaret?" "Yes, Mama." The voice was barely above a whisper. Webb worked quickly, explaining the process as he always did to put young subjects at ease. The camera was a wooden box with a brass lens. The plate was a sheet of polished, silver-coated copper, prepared with light-sensitive chemicals. The exposure would take between 10 and 30 seconds depending on the light, during which Margaret must not move at all or her image would blur. "Have you sat for a photograph before, Miss Thornton?" "No, sir." "Then I'll tell you a secret." Webb crouched beside the camera, making eye contact with the girl. "Some people think the camera steals a piece of your soul. Do you believe that?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I don't know if I have a soul to steal." The response made Louisa stiffen. "Margaret." "Sorry, Mama." Webb returned to his camera, adjusting the focus, but the exchange lingered in his mind. What kind of 9-year-old questioned whether she possessed a soul? The light in the parlor was poor. Heavy curtains, dark wood, no direct sun. Webb asked permission to photograph Margaret outside on the front porch, where he could use natural light. Louisa hesitated, then agreed, provided Sarah accompanied them. They moved to the porch at 11:30. Webb set up his equipment while Margaret sat in a wicker chair positioned to catch the morning light. From here, the Oak Avenue stretched away toward the main road, and to the left, partially visible through the trees, were the quarters where the enslaved population lived. To the right, beyond a grove of pines, was the rice mill. And behind the mill, though Webb could not see it from the porch, was the place where they had hanged Daniel Morrison 3 days earlier. While Webb prepared his chemicals, Sarah stood near the porch railing, her face turned toward the quarters. She had been at Thornton Hall for 11 years. She had seen things, and she knew that Margaret had seen things too. 3 nights before, on October 14th, an enslaved man named Daniel had been accused of stealing a silver pocket watch from Edmund Thornton's study. The watch was found hidden in Daniel's cabin. Daniel claimed he had never seen it before, that someone must have placed it there, but Edmund Thornton was not interested in explanations. Theft was theft, and an example had to be made. They hanged Daniel from a live oak near the rice mill at dawn on October 15th. The entire enslaved population was required to watch, including the house servants, including Sarah. Edmund Thornton wanted everyone to understand what happened to those who stole from their betters, but Margaret had not been required to attend. She was a child, sheltered from such unpleasantness. Or she should have been. Sarah had seen Margaret standing at her bedroom window during the hanging. The window overlooked the rice mill. The girl had watched the entire thing, the reading of charges, the noose placed around Daniel's neck, the moment the rope pulled taut. Sarah had watched the girl watching, and she had seen Margaret's expression. Not horror, not fear, but a kind of focused documentation, as if she were memorizing every detail for later examination. That was 3 days ago. Now Margaret sat on the porch, being photographed, and she held that same expression, present but removed, observing but not participating. Webb emerged from beneath his focusing cloth and made final adjustments. "Ready, Miss Thornton? Remember, you must be absolutely still for 30 seconds. Don't even blink if you can help it." Margaret nodded once. Webb uncapped the lens. The exposure began. For 28 seconds, the girl remained motionless. Then, in the final 2 seconds, before Webb replaced the lens cap, something changed in Margaret's eyes. Not a movement of her body, but a shift in her gaze, as if she were looking through Webb instead of at him. As if she were seeing something beyond the porch, beyond the oak trees, something that existed in memory or imagination or both. Webb capped the lens. "Excellent. You did beautifully." Margaret stood without speaking and walked back into the house. Sarah lingered on the porch. "Mr. Webb, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do your pictures ever show things that weren't there when you took them?" Webb stopped packing his equipment. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sarah glanced toward the door to make sure they were alone. "Do you ever develop a plate and see something in the image that you didn't see when you were looking through the camera? Sometimes there are imperfections in the silver coating. Sometimes dust or scratches create marks that might look like shadows or shapes. Why do you ask?" Sarah shook her head. "No reason. Just wondering." But her tone suggested otherwise, and Webb filed the exchange away along with Margaret's strange comment about souls and Louisa's phrasing about remembering her daughter. Webb returned to his rented room above the apothecary in Beaufort Town at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He carried with him 8 exposed plates from 4 sittings. The Thornton girl, a merchant's wife, twin boys whose father owned the largest cotton warehouse in the district, and a daguerreotype he had taken before arriving at Thornton Hall, one he had not been commissioned to create. That morning, at dawn, Webb had stopped his wagon near the rice mill on Thornton property. He had seen the rope still hanging from the live oak, the ground beneath it disturbed. Someone had told him in town the previous day about the hanging, about Daniel Morrison, about Edmund Thornton's reputation for harsh discipline. Webb had taken the photograph with the body already cut down and buried, but the rope remained, and ropes told their own stories. He had documented similar aftermath scenes before. A whipping post, auction block manacles, evidence that could be sent north to people who still believed Southern slavery was somehow gentler than its Caribbean or Brazilian cousins. The abolitionists needed proof of what happened to human beings under the regime of cotton and rice, proof that could not be dismissed as exaggeration. Now, in his rented room, Webb prepared to develop all 8 plates using the delicate process that had made him one of the more skilled daguerreotypists working the Southern Circuit. First, he heated mercury in a small spirit lamp until vapor rose. Then he positioned each exposed plate face down above the vapor, watching as the image gradually appeared on the silvered surface. Too little vapor, and the image would be faint. Too much, and it would darken beyond recognition. The art was in the timing. He developed the merchant's wife first. A good image, properly focused, no flaws. The twin boys next. One had moved slightly during exposure, creating a ghost blur, but the other was sharp. Then he developed the plate from that morning, the rope hanging from the live oak near the rice mill. The image emerged gradually through the mercury vapor. The tree, the rope, the disturbed ground, and something else. A dark shape at the edge of the frame, partially obscured by foliage. Webb leaned closer. It looked like a figure standing in the background, watching. Probably one of the enslaved workers who had been present during the hanging. The morning light had been dim, and Webb had not noticed anyone when he took the photograph. But daguerreotypes sometimes captured details the human eye overlooked. He set that plate aside and reached for the final exposure. Margaret Thornton. The mercury vapor rose. The image began to form. The girl sitting in the wicker chair, her hands folded, her face turned toward the camera, her eyes carrying that strange removed quality he had noticed. And behind her left shoulder, blurred but visible, another face. Webb stared at the plate for 10 seconds before his brain processed what he was seeing. A man's face, tilted at an unnatural angle, features distorted. The neck elongated, the skin darkened, the eyes half closed. A hanged man. Webb's first thought was that he had made a mistake, mixed up the plates, accidentally developed one image over another, created a double exposure through carelessness. But he had taken only one photograph of Margaret Thornton, and the plate he was holding was the only plate from that sitting. The case numbers matched his ledger. There was no other explanation except for the one his eyes were giving him. This single plate contained 2 images. He examined the face more carefully. The features were male, African, distorted by death. The position suggested hanging. Head cocked to one side, neck stretched, shoulders slumped. The figure appeared to be behind Margaret, though the perspective was wrong. It was as if 2 different scenes had been layered onto the same surface. The girl photographed from straight on, and the hanged man photographed from below, looking up at a body suspended from a rope. Webb's hands began to shake. He set the plate down carefully and stepped away from the table. In 15 years of photography, he had never seen anything like this. Daguerreotypes did not create double exposures the way paper negatives could. Each plate captured a single moment in time. There was no mechanism for layering images unless the image was already there. He returned to the table and picked up the plate from the morning, the one showing the rope and tree. He held it up to the window light and examined it closely. The dark figure at the edge of the frame was more defined now that his eyes knew to look for it. Not a person standing in the background, but a shape hanging from a lower branch, partially hidden by leaves. A body. Daniel Morrison's body, still hanging when Webb had taken the photograph, though Webb had been told it was cut down at dawn, which meant either someone had lied about the timing, or the body had been left hanging longer than reported, or something else was happening that Webb did not understand. He compared the 2 plates side by side. The hanged figure in Margaret's portrait resembled the dark shape in the morning photograph. Same angle of the head, same elongated neck. As if the act of photographing the hanging site and then photographing the girl had somehow pulled the first image into the second, creating a visual echo across time and space. Ghost photography was not unknown. Webb had heard of spiritualists in New York claiming to capture images of the dead alongside the living. He had dismissed such claims as fraud, tricks achieved through double exposure or chemical manipulation. But this was different. This was unintentional. This was truth leaking through. Webb wrapped both plates in cloth and locked them in his trunk. Then he poured himself a measure of whiskey from the bottle he kept for steadying his nerves after difficult sittings, and he sat by the window and thought through his options. Option 1. Destroy both plates. Tell Louisa Thornton the exposure had failed, the chemicals were contaminated, no image had developed. Keep the $3 and move on. Option 2. Give Louisa Thornton only the girl's portrait, after using a fine brush and chemical solution to carefully remove the ghostly figure in the background. The process would take hours and might damage the plate, but it was technically possible. Option 3. Tell someone what he had discovered, but who and to what end. Option 4. Keep both plates as evidence. Document what he had found. Send them north along with his other hidden images. He was still considering these options at 6 o'clock when someone knocked on his door. Webb opened it to find Sarah standing in the hallway. She was breathing hard, as if she had run the entire 3 miles from Thornton Hall to Beaufort Town. "Mr. Webb, I need to see the photograph you took today." "That's not possible. The image is not ready for—" "Please." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I need to see if it shows what I think it shows." Webb stepped aside and let her enter. He closed the door and locked it. Then he retrieved the plate from his trunk and held it up to the lamplight so Sarah could see. Her reaction was immediate. Her hand went to her mouth. Her eyes widened. And then, instead of fear or shock, her expression shifted to something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I knew it," she said quietly. "I knew he would be there." Sarah sat on Webb's single chair, and for the next 20 minutes, she told him what had actually happened on the morning of October 15th. Daniel Morrison had not stolen Edmund Thornton's pocket watch. Edmund's son, James, a young man of 22 who lived in Charleston but visited the plantation regularly, had lost the watch gambling. Rather than confess this to his father, James had placed the watch in Daniel's cabin and then discovered it there, accusing Daniel of theft. Edmund Thornton, eager to make an example and unwilling to believe his son capable of deception, had ordered the hanging without investigation. Sarah had been friends with Daniel. She had known him for 6 years. He was quiet, honest, one of the few people on the plantation who could read and write, having been taught in secret by a previous house servant. He had been planning to run. Not soon, but eventually. He had been saving money, small amounts stolen not from the master, but from visitors who left coins carelessly on tables. In another year, he would have had enough to attempt escape north. James knew, Sarah said. He knew Daniel was planning to run. He'd been watching him. So when James needed someone to blame for his own mistake, Daniel was convenient. "And you saw the hanging?" "We all saw it. Every person on this plantation stood there and watched while Edmund Thornton read the charges and the overseer tied the noose. Daniel said he was innocent. He said it 3 times. But Mr. Thornton just nodded to the overseer and—" She stopped, composing herself. It took 4 minutes for him to die. The drop wasn't long enough to break his neck clean. He strangled. Webb felt sick. He had photographed the aftermath of violence many times, but hearing the details of a slow strangulation was different. "Margaret Thornton watched from her window," Sarah continued. "I saw her. She stood there the whole time, just watching. She's always watching. That child sees everything that happens on this plantation, and her mother knows it, and her father knows it. But they pretend she doesn't. They pretend she's innocent, sheltered. But Margaret knows what they are, what all of us are. And you think that's why—" Webb gestured to the plate. "Why he appears in her photograph? I don't know how such things work. But I know Daniel Morrison died 3 days ago, unjustly, and nobody will ever be held accountable. Not in this world. Maybe that photograph is the only justice he'll get. Maybe that's why the camera caught him, because someone needs to know the truth." Webb understood what Sarah was asking without her having to say it directly. She wanted him to keep the photograph, to make sure it reached people who could do something with it, to turn this impossible image into testimony. "If I use this," Webb said carefully, "if I send this north, people will question its authenticity. They'll say it's a fraud. Ghost photography is already controversial. Spiritualists have damaged their own credibility with obvious fakes. This will be dismissed as another trick." "Then show them both." Sarah pointed to the trunk where Webb kept the morning photograph, the one showing the rope and the barely visible shape in the background. "Show them the tree. Show them the rope. Show them the girl with Daniel behind her. Let people decide what they're seeing. What truth costs." Sarah left Webb's room at 7:30 after extracting a promise that he would not destroy the plates. Webb waited until she was gone, then lit more lamps and returned to his workspace. He needed to make copies. A daguerreotype was a unique object. There was no negative, no way to produce multiple prints from a single exposure. But there were methods. Webb could photograph the existing daguerreotype using his camera, creating a new plate that reproduced the original. The copy would lose some detail, and the silver tones would shift, but the essential image would remain. He could make 3, maybe 4 copies before the process degraded the quality beyond recognition. He worked through the night. By dawn on October 18th, he had created 3 copies of Margaret's portrait, with the ghostly figure behind her, and 2 copies of the morning photograph showing the hanging site. He wrapped the originals in oilcloth and hid them in the false bottom of his trunk. The copies went into separate packages, addressed to different contacts in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. But before he sealed the packages, Webb made one additional copy. This one he kept for himself, stored in a small leather case he carried in his inner coat pocket. Insurance or evidence, or perhaps just the need to prove to himself that what he had captured was real. At 9 o'clock that morning, Louisa Thornton sent her driver to Beaufort to collect Margaret's portrait. Webb met the driver at the apothecary door and handed him a sealed case containing a daguerreotype. Inside was an image of Margaret Thornton, sitting in the wicker chair, hands folded, face turned toward the camera. No ghostly figure, no hanged man. No truth except what Webb had carefully painted over with chemical solution and a fine brush, obscuring the impossible with the plausible. Louisa Thornton would receive the portrait she had commissioned, the keeper of Margaret's childhood, the lie preserved in silver, and the truth would travel north in 3 packages, carried by mail coach and steamship, to people who collected impossible things and tried to make sense of them. 3 months passed. Webb continued his circuit through South Carolina and Georgia, photographing merchants and ministers and plantation families. He tried not to think about the daguerreotype hidden in his coat pocket. He tried not to wonder whether the packages had reached their destinations, or what had happened if they had. Then, on January 12, 1855, a letter arrived at the apothecary in Beaufort, addressed to Silas Webb. The postmark was Boston. The sender was Wendell Phillips, a prominent abolitionist and one of Webb's contacts in the Anti-Slavery Society. Webb opened the letter in his room with hands that shook slightly. "Dear Mr. Webb, I received your recent package containing 2 daguerreotypes. The first shows a hanging site, which I understand to be on property belonging to a Mr. Edmund Thornton in Beaufort District. The second shows a young girl, whom I presume to be Thornton's daughter, with what appears to be the image of a hanged man visible behind her. I must confess, when I first viewed these plates, I believed them to be fraudulent. Another example of spiritualist manipulation intended to exploit grief or credulity. but I showed them to Dr. Samuel Howe, who has some expertise in photographic processes, and he could find no evidence of double exposure or chemical trickery. The images appear to be genuine recordings of what the camera saw, however impossible that may seem. We are proceeding carefully. If we publish these photographs without proper context, they will be dismissed as fabrications. But if we can verify the story you included, the hanging of Daniel Morrison on October 15, 1854, the false accusation, the presence of the child during or immediately after the event, then these images become something extraordinary. Not merely documentation of a crime, but documentation of conscience itself, of guilt made visible, of truth refusing to be buried. Have you told anyone else about these photographs? Has the Thornton family seen them? Yours in the cause, Wendell Phillips Webb, read the letter 3 times. Then he burned it, as he burned all correspondence that might connect him to abolitionist activities. But the question Phillips had asked stayed with him. Had the Thornton family seen the photographs? Not the altered version Webb had given to Louisa Thornton, but the originals, or the copies he had sent north. Had word somehow traveled back? He got his answer 4 days later when Edmund Thornton walked into the apothecary and asked to speak with Silas Webb privately. Edmund Thornton was 58 years old, a tall man with gray hair and a face that had been handsome once but had hardened into something more severe. He wore a black coat and carried a walking stick with a silver handle. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely certain of its authority. "Mr. Webb, I have a delicate matter to discuss. Perhaps we could step outside?" They walked to the empty lot behind the apothecary, where a few scrub trees provided minimal shade. January in low-country South Carolina was mild, barely cool, with the smell of salt marsh carried on the breeze. Thornton got directly to the point. "I understand you photographed my daughter Margaret last October." "Yes, sir. Your wife commissioned the portrait." "And you delivered a satisfactory image?" "I believe so, sir." "Good. Then it will surprise you to learn that a rather different version of that portrait has appeared in abolitionist circles in Boston. A version showing Margaret with—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "With certain elements that were not present during the sitting." Webb kept his face neutral. "I'm not sure I understand, sir." "I think you understand perfectly." Thornton's grip tightened on his walking stick. "Someone has created a fraudulent daguerreotype, claiming to show my daughter in the presence of a ghostly figure. The implication, of course, is that this figure represents a man who was executed on my property for theft. The abolitionists are using this fabricated image to suggest that my family is somehow haunted by guilt, that the execution was unjust, that—" He stopped himself. "It's propaganda, Mr. Webb. Vicious, calculated propaganda designed to damage my reputation, and by extension, the reputation of every property owner in South Carolina. I'm sorry to hear that, sir, but I don't see how this involves me. Don't you?" Thornton stepped closer. "You're the only photographer who made a daguerreotype of Margaret on the date in question. If copies exist, they originated with you. Either you created the fraud yourself, or you allowed someone access to the original plate." Webb made himself meet Thornton's eyes. "The plate I delivered to your wife is the only plate I made. If other versions exist, they were created without my knowledge or consent." It was almost true. The copies Webb had made were from the unaltered original, not from the cleaned version he had given Louisa. A technical distinction, but one that gave him something to stand on. Thornton studied Webb for a long moment. "You're lying, but I can't prove it." So let me be very clear about what will happen if any more copies of this supposed ghost photograph appear. You will be arrested for fraud. Your equipment will be confiscated. Your business will be destroyed. And if the authorities find evidence that you've been corresponding with abolitionists, you'll hang from the same tree where Daniel Morrison was executed. The threat was delivered with perfect calm, as if Thornton were discussing the weather. Do we understand each other, Mr. Webb? Yes, sir. Excellent. Then this conversation is concluded. Thornton walked away, leaving Webb standing in the empty lot with his heart pounding and his mind racing through scenarios, none of them good. That evening, Webb met Sarah at a small church on the edge of Beaufort's colored district. She had sent him a note asking him to come, and he had arrived after dark, moving carefully to avoid being seen. They sat in the last pew while Sarah told him what had happened at Thornton Hall over the past week. Edmund Thornton had received a letter from a colleague in Charleston, warning him that abolitionists in Boston were circulating a daguerreotype supposedly showing his daughter with a hanged man's ghost. Thornton had immediately sent his son James to Boston to investigate. James had located the photograph at the offices of the Anti-Slavery Society and had attempted to purchase it. When they refused to sell, James had threatened legal action, claiming the image was a malicious forgery that defamed the Thornton family. The abolitionists had responded by making more copies and sending them to newspapers in New York and Philadelphia. The story was spreading. Edmund is furious, Sarah said. He's been questioning everyone on the plantation. He wants to know who talked to you, who told you about Daniel's hanging, who might have known you were making that photograph. He hasn't questioned Margaret yet, but he will. And if she tells him she saw Daniel die, will she tell him? I don't know. That child is hard to read. She might protect herself by saying nothing. Or she might tell the truth just to see what happens. Webb thought about his options. He could leave South Carolina immediately, take his equipment and disappear into North Carolina or Virginia. But running would look like guilt, and Thornton had enough influence to have him pursued. He could destroy the plate he still carried, the one in his coat pocket. But the copies were already in circulation. The image existed beyond his control now. Or he could stay and face whatever came, knowing that the truth was out there, documented, visible, even if he paid the price for it. What would you do? Webb asked Sarah. If you were me. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. I'd remember why you took that photograph in the first place. Not for money, not for fame, but because someone needed to see what happened to Daniel Morrison. Someone needed to know his name. If you run now, if you hide, people will assume the photograph was fake. But if you stand by it, even if they arrest you, even if they... She didn't finish the sentence. If you stand by it, then maybe Daniel's death means something. Webb knew she was right, but knowing and choosing were different things. He left the church at 10 o'clock and walked back to his room through streets that suddenly felt very small, very exposed, with eyes watching from every window. On January 23, 1855, 9 days after Edmund Thornton's confrontation with Webb, the New York Tribune published an article titled "The Ghost of Beaufort District: Photography, Spiritualism, and the Crimes of Slavery." The article featured a woodcut reproduction of Margaret Thornton's portrait, showing the ghostly figure behind her shoulder. The quality was poor. Woodcuts could not capture the detail of daguerreotypes, but the image was recognizable enough. The article described the photograph as remarkable evidence of the moral weight carried by those who profit from human bondage. and claimed that the image proved the crime of slavery haunts even the innocent children of slaveholders, whose consciences cannot escape the truth of what their wealth is built upon. It was inflammatory, rhetorical, and exactly the kind of abolitionist propaganda that made Southern slaveholders furious. Edmund Thornton arrived in Beaufort the day after the article appeared. This time he did not come alone. He brought the county sheriff and 2 magistrates, and they went directly to the apothecary where Silas Webb rented his room. Webb was arrested at noon on charges of fraud, defamation, and conspiracy to distribute abolitionist materials. His equipment was confiscated. His trunk was searched. They found nothing in the false bottom. Webb had moved those plates a week earlier, entrusting them to a free black family in Charleston, who agreed to hide them until it was safe to send them north. But they found correspondence. Letters from Wendell Phillips. Letters from other abolitionists. Evidence that Silas Webb had been documenting slavery for years, collecting images and testimony, sending them north to fuel the anti-slavery movement. The trial was held 3 weeks later, on February 14th. It lasted less than a day. Webb was convicted of all charges and sentenced to 6 months in the county jail, followed by permanent expulsion from South Carolina. Louisa Thornton never testified. Margaret Thornton was never called as a witness. The photograph itself was presented as evidence. The altered version Webb had delivered to the family, showing only the girl, no ghost, no hanged man. The prosecution argued that Webb had created a second fraudulent version after delivering the legitimate portrait, using darkroom trickery to add the ghostly figure. Webb's defense was simple. He had photographed what the camera saw. If the image showed a hanged man, it was because a hanged man had been there, whether visible to the eye or not, whether in the physical world or in the moral one. The jury deliberated for 30 minutes. During sentencing, the judge told Webb that he was fortunate to receive only 6 months. In another county, the judge said, "You would hang for this. Be grateful for mercy." Webb served his sentence in a cell that measured 8 feet by 6 feet, with one small window that faced north. He spent his days reading what few books the jail allowed, and his nights thinking about the daguerreotype still hidden in Charleston, the truth captured in silver and chemicals, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Silas Webb was released from jail on August 14, 1855. He was escorted to the South Carolina border by 2 deputies, who made clear that if he returned, he would be arrested immediately and held without trial. Webb took the first coach north to Richmond, then continued to Philadelphia, where he settled and resumed his photography work, never returning south of the Mason-Dixon line. He lived another 33 years, photographing civilians during the war, then immigrants and laborers afterward. He never spoke publicly about the Margaret Thornton daguerreotype, but he never stopped making copies. Every few years, he would reproduce the image and send prints to colleagues, to historians, to anyone he thought might preserve it. The photograph became an object of fascination and controversy. Spiritualists claimed it as proof of ghosts. Abolitionists used it as evidence of slavery's moral poison. Skeptics dismissed it as obvious fraud, and everyone who saw it had an opinion about whether the hanged figure was really there or whether the camera had simply captured what people expected to see: guilt made visible. But Webb was not the only one who kept copies. Sarah, the house servant at Thornton Hall, had obtained one of the reproductions Webb made before his arrest. She kept it wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in her cabin, and when she finally escaped north in 1862, walking the entire distance after Sherman's army created enough chaos for escape to be possible. She brought the photograph with her. She settled in Boston worked as a seamstress, and kept the daguerreotype on her mantle as a memorial to Daniel Morrison and all the people who had died on Thornton Hall plantation. Wendell Phillips kept his copy in the archives of the Anti-Slavery Society, where it remained until the building burned in 1879, destroying most of the collection. But someone had made copies of the copies by then, and those copies entered other collections, other archives. And Margaret Thornton, she kept something too, though not a photograph. Margaret Adelaide Thornton lived to be 73 years old. After the Civil War ended and Thornton Hall was sold to pay debts, she moved to Savannah with her mother. Louisa died in 1868. Margaret never married. She worked as a school teacher, first for white children, then, during Reconstruction, for black children in a school funded by Northern missionaries. She never spoke about the photograph. When asked, she claimed not to remember the sitting, not to remember Silas Webb, not to remember October of 1854 at all. Her childhood, she said, was too distant to recall clearly. But in 1923, 4 years before her death, Margaret wrote a letter to the Charleston Historical Society. The letter was discovered in their archives in 1962, filed under correspondence marked Unverified Accounts. Dear Sir, I am writing regarding a daguerreotype that has circulated in various historical collections since the 1850s, supposedly showing me as a child with the image of a hanged man visible behind me. I have been asked about this photograph many times over my life, and I have consistently denied knowing anything about it. I am now 70 years old. My health is failing, and I find I no longer have the energy to maintain certain fictions. The photograph is real. The figure in the image is Daniel Morrison, who was hanged on my father's plantation on October 15, 1854, for a theft he did not commit. I watched his execution from my bedroom window. I was 9 years old. No one knew I was watching, or if they knew, they pretended not to. 3 days later, Mr. Silas Webb photographed me on the front porch. I sat very still, as instructed, and while I sat there, I thought about Daniel Morrison hanging from that tree. I thought about his face. I thought about how long it took him to die. I thought about how no one would remember him, how his death would mean nothing to anyone except the people he left behind. When Mr. Webb developed the photograph and the figure appeared, I heard about this later from Sarah, who worked in our house. I understood it as something I cannot quite explain. Not a ghost exactly, not a technical error, but a truth that refused to stay buried, an image that insisted on being seen. My father destroyed the original plate, or tried to, but copies existed. They exist still, and I am glad they do. I do not know if I believe in hauntings, but I know that some crimes demand acknowledgement. I know that Daniel Morrison died unjustly. I know that my family's wealth was built on the suffering of people like him. And I know that the photograph Mr. Webb made, whether by accident or design, whether through chemistry or something else, captured a truth that mattered. Let this letter stand as my testimony. I saw Daniel Morrison die, and I am sorry I did not speak then. Margaret Adelaide Thornton. The Historical Society filed the letter away without comment. By 1923, the daguerreotype had already passed into legend, reproduced so many times that authenticating any particular version was impossible. The letter changed nothing officially, but it confirmed what Sarah had always known, what Silas Webb had believed, and what the photograph itself had shown. That some truths leak through even when every attempt is made to bury them. No copy of the original daguerreotype survives in any authenticated collection. The Anti-Slavery Society archives burned. Webb's personal papers were scattered after his death. The Historical Society claims its files contain no photographic materials from the relevant period. But every few years, someone posts an image online claiming to be the Margaret Thornton ghost photograph. The quality is always poor, copied and recopied, scanned from old books, reproduced from woodcuts. The details vary. Some versions show the figure behind the girl's left shoulder. Others show it to her right. Some show a clear face. Others show only a blur. Collectors argue about authenticity. Experts analyze silver nitrate patterns and chemical signatures. Skeptics point out the inconsistencies and declare the whole story a hoax. And in Beaufort, South Carolina, in the district where Thornton Hall once stood, people still tell the story of the photograph that showed what shouldn't be possible. A child's portrait with a dead man's face visible behind her. Proof that cameras sometimes capture more than light. They say if you go to the historical archives in Charleston and ask very politely, they might show you one of the copies kept in storage, not on display, but not quite destroyed. They say the image still has power. That people who look at it too long start seeing things in the background that weren't there a moment ago. That the photograph refuses to be forgotten the way Daniel Morrison's death was meant to be forgotten. But maybe that's just what people say when they need a story to carry what history won't hold. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.